Thank you, John. Earlier today, you asked if there were anybody here from the right wing. So I've been given a correct label, former Secretary General of the Center Party. So that's a party with a slogan, not to the left, not to the right, straightforward. So a party in the center, formerly called the Farmers' Party, and whereas the two biggest Norwegian parties, the Conservatives and the Labour Party, both are pro-EU, my party is usually the strongest no party. So we've been in coalition governments with both the Conservatives and with Labour and left socialists. But anybody wanting us into a coalition government know what that means. They just have to bury their ambitions of a Norwegian EU membership that they want. So, quite a few negative things have been said here today about EU's foreign, trade and defense policy, for all good reasons. But I will not add to that. I've been asked to say something positive, not about EU's foreign policy, but concerning the need for independent voices in Europe. So I will focus on some aspects of Norway's foreign policy as a European non-member of EU. Before I start, I have to make one thing very clear. Norway is not a facts democracy ruled from Brussels. I repeat, Norway is not a facts democracy. If my country had been that, our foreign policy would have been determined by detailed directives from Brussels and sent with the help of a gadget so outdated that the older part of the population almost has forgotten how it looks like, whereas the younger part of the population hardly has seen one. And our Minister of Foreign Affairs' response to every directive would have been, yes, master. This is as far from the truth as possible. Still, we hear about the British establishment telling British people that we Norwegians now consider ourselves living in a facts democracy. Guess what the Norwegian establishment tells the Norwegian people? They tell us that in the UK, people mock us for being a facts democracy. And when some of our cabinet members go to Britain, they mock the same agreement that they have chosen to base their own European policy on. These are the same sort of politicians who not only warned Norwegian voters against splendid isolation, we were warned that outside of the European Union, we would be an Albania close to the North Pole, no less. That's a Norwegian version of scaremongering. Enough of our stupidities coming from the Norwegian and the British establishment. Let's face the facts. The EU is a single market as well as a political and European and economic union. Norway's relationship with the EU, as we've heard, is based on the EEA agreement, very limited compared to EU membership. It takes Norway in the single market, but we adopt less than 10% of EU lawmaking, as Helle said. The EEA agreement does not include the EU customs union and trade agreements with third-party countries. So, the common foreign and security policy through which the EU wishes to speak with one voice in international fora is also outside of the scope of Norway's agreement with the EU. Brussels likes to portray itself as the center of everything. If this had been true, Norway would of course have been a second-class European actor in international politics. But the real world is so much bigger than the European Union. Most important international cooperation take place outside the EU, both when it comes to economy, environment, peace, solidarity, human rights. What regards foreign policy, the EU countries are in fact closer to living in a fact democracy than Norway is. The European Union very often speaks with one voice in key international fora. The Lisbon Treaty, entering into force in 2009, meant that even more of the member states' foreign policy became coordinated. By becoming EU members, our good neighbors, Sweden, Denmark and Finland, lost their place at many a diplomatic table. EU negotiates on behalf of them, for instance within the UN system and the World Trade Organization. Norway, on the other hand, still has its own voice on the international stage. Being outside of the EU, Norway can remain an independent voice in Europe and an independent voice in the world. Although we are a small country with just 5 million inhabitants, we not only participate actively in international fora, actually we have become a global player that punches well beyond our weight. I'll give some examples of that, but let's first go back to the situation in 1994, when Norway and 3 other countries had referendums about whether we should join the EU. Brazil's then Minister of Environment, José Lutzenberger, called it a disaster if Norway and Sweden became members of the European Union. He said it would be no good for countries in the third world if Europe started speaking with one voice. In such a case, the third world could no longer maneuver between different European countries during international negotiations, which until then had been important to them. Lutzenberger was one of more than 60 internationally well-known environmentalists who signed an appeal to the Norwegian people advising us to remain independent of the European Union. Edward Goldsmith was also among those 60. I guess there are a few British here remembering him. Well, that was then. What happened afterwards? How has Norway used its freedom of action outside the EU? Well, let's take Sweden first. Swedish foreign policy changed after joining the EU. When Brussels didn't fancy Swedish views on upcoming international negotiations, their cabinet members soon started coming to Norwegian colleagues. So an early example of that was the negotiations about the so-called Basel Convention in 1995. It was about transport of waste from rich to poor countries. There was a common Nordic proposal to the benefit of the environment and the local population in the third world. The Nordic EU members were given 24 hours to withdraw the proposal. Otherwise, they would have gone to the European Court. That did not apply for Norway, of course, so the proposal was still there, although coming from only one country. And the most pro-EU German minister who was there said afterwards she was glad that Norway had remained outside of the European Union. This has gone on further. There have been environmental summits in Johannesburg 2002, Durban in 2011, where more or less the same thing has been the case. I don't think there's time to go further into them there. I just have to mention that we've been a driving force in the United Nations on biodiversity, climate change measures, conservation of rainforests, and disarmament. In 2011, Norway put forward a proposal that led to an international agreement limiting the use of toxic chemical mercury. Then we have the peace negotiations. As small and independent nations, the Nordic countries have had special advantages when it comes to urgent conflicts. So in addition to the most well-known case, the Middle East, the Oslo Agreement, for instance, Sri Lanka, Colombia, Haiti, Guatemala, and the Philippines are examples of where Norwegians have been negotiating. Several reasons for this, but most important that we are not in the EU, because Sweden was much more active before, and there's no other reason why they didn't continue being that. So then there is this terror list, for an example, EU's terror list, which means, well, we're all against terrorists, again, as several other speakers have said here, but I mean, how is such a list produced? Does it mean who some governments consider their enemies? They consider them terrorists, and the EU wants certain advantages from those governments. So, okay, we'll make a compromise once again. So we put them into the terror list. But then that has really made life quite hard for Norwegian peace negotiators when suddenly one of the parts that they try to unite comes on an EU terror list that doesn't make the government being less brutal to them. On the contrary, and Sri Lanka is a good example of that, because as you know, not all of the countries and the areas I mentioned have been success stories. This is not easy, neither for Norwegians nor for others. What a British professor once said, that the best way of creating peace in the Middle East would be leaving to Norway to rule and decide everything in Jerusalem. And, well, I don't think I could have promised peace in the Middle East anyway. Do-gooders don't always succeed, but at least we try, and sometimes we have results. The Norwegian Conservative Party has always been pro-EU, as I said. When in 2001 they got the foreign minister, he seemed to believe that most of all this fuss about peace negotiation was anti-EU propaganda. Then he met his British colleague Jack Straw for the first time. And what did Jack Straw ask him about? He asked him about Sri Lanka. He wasn't very well prepared for that. But then he went to the United States, and Colin Powell did the same thing, and then he was better prepared. He learned very quickly that he was in possession of a diplomatic gold mine through all these peace negotiations. I'll finish with a short comment on the ITV debate on Thursday that I think quite a few of you looked at. I had the pleasure of seeing most of it as well. Nicola Sturgeon said that Norway and Switzerland have to abide by the EU rules. I hope that those of you who have been here today have understood that this is clearly not true. One of the other Yes women said on ITV on Thursday that only belonging to a bigger grouping gives the UK influence. Amazing, or rather rubbish. I mean, when small Norway can gain so much influence at the international stage outside of the EU, why on earth shouldn't Great Britain be able to? Thank you very much.